Welcome. We're going to talk about accountability in politics. Actually, we're going to talk about administrative oversight and accountability. This is kind of the final chapter that we cover in class, but it's an important chapter because it sort of ties a lot of stuff together. At the beginning of class, we talked about the relationship between citizens, representatives, the law, and then agencies. Citizens give up their power to representatives. Representatives are held accountable to the public through elections. Those representatives pass laws. Those laws give power to agencies. The agencies are held accountable to the legislators or those representatives through what we're going to talk about today, oversight committees. But they ensure that those agencies do the work of the law properly. Agencies hold themselves accountable through delegated power and hierarchy and structures. But ultimately, in the end, how do we make sure that agencies are doing what they're asked to do? Well, that falls primarily upon the responsibility of the elected officials who've given those agencies power. So elected officials, in particular members of Congress, the legislature, they create the organizational structure within wherein bureaucrats work. That's to say, like we talked about earlier, that even though the president or the governor is the manager of that organization, they simply can't reorganize it because Congress or the elected body gives that agency power through the law to do the work. Now, as they give them power to do that work, they give them instructions, but they also set up how that agency works. So Congress authorizes those positions and the programs that those people administer, those bureaucrats. They send funds. They authorize programs. They also retain the right to make sure that that money is being spent properly, that the authority is being used properly, and those agencies and those programs are doing the work that they've been tasked to do. Now, here's the thing: members of Congress are elected because they're popular, and they're popular, and they want to win votes, and they want to make sure that they can go pass laws. Even though a big job of what they should be doing is oversight, it's not very attractive when it comes to like earning votes. They can't go home to their constituents and say, hey, guess what? I made sure that the TSA did its job screening airplanes. What they rather would do would be go home and say, hey, my constituents, I passed this law, and this law is going to protect these people, or I did this thing with the budget. Okay, well, that's fine. So what happens is oversight, which is what we should be having them do more of, is very, very low in their priorities. Unless they're responding to some crisis, they generally don't get any credit for sitting on these committees that watch over to make sure that agencies do their job properly. So McCubbin and Schwartz talk about this in terms of the type of oversight that elected officials do. They call it fire alarm oversight. Once there's a fire, all the firemen come running to put out the fire. Whenever there's a problem, whenever there's a complaint, Congress runs to their oversight committee, and the oversight committee calls in that agency and says, hey, what are you doing? Why are you, doing this thing that's wrong? Well, at that point, the fire's already started. The problem already exists. And so it's not very effective. It's not very good at preventing problems. What would be better is if they did sort of like a routine police patrol, that they were out there making sure the agencies were doing their jobs properly, routinely checking in, making sure the money was being spent properly. A lot of people would think on a police department, the SWAT team is the coolest. Sure, except they're probably valuable only in very, very small circumstances. The most valuable people in the police department are like locking up buildings, making sure that robberies don't exist, engaging in the public in a way that's going to prevent crime. That's the most effective. But it costs money, it costs time, and elected officials don't get a lot of benefit from that. So what happens is we get a lot of routine, fire alarm oversight because it's cheap. And it's effective at solving problems after they exist, but it's not what we would hope for. But it is cheap. All right. So why do members of Congress want to watch over agencies? Well, they want to make sure that the agencies are following the intent of the law of Congress. That's to say, did those agencies that we give power to do the work of Congress as it was described in the law? Oversight also exists to make sure that agencies aren't abusing their power, they're not being wasteful with their resources, that there's no fraud or corruption. We do oversight to collect information to make sure programs are running well, to see how they're doing, to see what's working, what's not working. That's part of program effectiveness. They also want to go into agencies to make sure that certain issues that are true to them or important to them get done. So imagine you've got a member of Congress that maybe has a brother or sister who's been a victim of domestic violence, and they do oversight to make sure that domestic violence issues, the things that are core to their beliefs, get investigated. That the Justice Department is doing that work for them. So those correctional, that part of that's personal advocacy. Some of it is like the prerogative of their party, the things that they want to hold true. And then ultimately, sometimes they have to reverse unpopular actions. In the wake of some discoveries by the TSA about people who are getting through screening, TSA changed their rules about how they screened individuals. And at points during the TSA's existence, they were actually touching people's bodies with the backs of their hands or like inside their belt line, and it made people uncomfortable. And so they had oversight hearings, and the TSA was told to change that, and they did, because Congress has the power to tell them that. Now, how do they do this oversight? Well, this generally happens through a couple of ways. The first is congressional committees and their staffs, and we'll talk about them. And then there's a whole part of Congress called the GAO, General Accountability Office, that goes out and investigates to make sure that programs are running well. And as it does those investigations, it can report back to members of Congress to make sure that those programs are working fine. And then ultimately, every agency also has performance-based information about client satisfaction surveys that we talked about before, but also how well they're doing their job. And so we use that pretty routinely. Now, legislative oversight through committees happens a couple of ways. We call that legislative review, where the legislature comes in, they form this committee. We already talked about in Political Science 100. They have these committees that approve bills for certain areas. Well, those areas, if they've given that bill power and they've approved that bill, let's say it's on transportation, some highway speed change, speed limit change. Well, if some representative wants to change the highway speed, it gets introduced in the House or the Senate and goes to a subcommittee on transportation. That committee looks through that law, they maybe write it, they revise it to make sure that it's going to be okay to do. And then once they approve it, it goes back to the House for the vote, and it's approved, and it goes to Senate for the approval of the vote, fine by fine. But that committee who gave that agency power to enforce that traffic speed, or the highway speed, they're called an authorizing committee. They authorized that law to be in place, and because they prepare that law, they give that law power, they have the responsibility to make sure that the agency that's in charge of enforcing that law is being true to the dictates of that law, the authority that they were given. That's one way. Another set of committees that oversee government function are called appropriation committees. And appropriation committees mark up the budget. They're the ones who are tasked to make sure that funding is allocated the right way, and they propose spending in these different areas. All of the appropriation committees in the House and the Senate have authority to make sure that all of the agencies who received money, all of them, are using that money effectively, and they're held accountable using financial means. So we have authorizing committees who deal with authority, appropriations committees who generally deal with money, but then we have these big, broad committees called Committees on Government Operations, Senate Committee on Government Affairs, House Committee on Government Reform. These are essentially members of Congress who sit in committee to make sure that the government is working smoothly, the entire executive branch is being true to their, that they're not violating any ethical considerations, that they're being true to the intent of the law. They're very, very powerful committees, and they can pull any agency in to make sure that the agency is doing the dictates of the law. So we have these three different types of committees who sit and make sure that the agencies are doing their job. And those agencies routinely report to these committees. But what happens is that members of Congress often aren't in those committee meetings. They'll send staff to be there because those representatives are out like fundraising or writing new laws or doing something different. So oversight is sort of mixed in terms of effectiveness. One of the crucial parts about every oversight function is that they need good information. And that getting good information is really, really crucial to make sure that agencies are doing their job and that Congress is making good headway in getting out there and solving problems. But there's a lot of ways that agencies can hide information, either by sheltering that information by not producing it for Congress, or providing a whole lot of useless data, and we'll talk about that. And honestly, sometimes Congress intrudes on agencies' information in a way that's inappropriate. So we'll talk about that too. One of the ways that information is sheltered is through secrecy, particularly with conduct like foreign affairs, Defense Department stuff, military strategy, Homeland Security. Those committees that oversee those agencies have to have security clearance to see that information. So once you have that security clearance, and if it's still classified or secret information, they can't share it with other people. So very, very few committees in Congress can either get information that's classified or top secret, or share that information with other members of Congress. And what happens normally is that an agency that wants to hide information, particularly about military tactics or something, or defense strategy, they'll classify that information and not provide it to Congress or those oversight committees because they don't have the classification required to see it. Now, it's possible that they're classifying stuff that really shouldn't be classified. They just want to hide it. But they also have times when Congress really needs to know what's going on, and these agencies classify that information, and Congress really needs to act on stuff, but they can't because that's hidden. So classifying some information as secret or classified or top secret really impedes Congress's ability to root out ineffective spending or ensure that agencies aren't going off board. Another way that agencies can hide information that might be crucial for congressional decision making is through executive privilege. Executive privilege exists in this weird realm where members of the executive office of the president, they exist outside of congressional oversight because Congress didn't give the executive branch power. The Congress gives the president power to manage the bureaucracy. Congress, though, authorizes agencies to exist. So if Congress authorizes agencies to exist and those agencies have congressional power, then Congress can pull those agencies back in. But the president gets to nominate who gets to lead those agencies, and Senate has to approve them. So somewhere between agencies themselves, these political appointees that the president chooses, and then the executive office of the president, like the Office of Management Budget, the National Security Council, somewhere in there, the president should have some ability to talk with his advisors confidentially and exclude some of those confidential conversations from Congress. But Congress has a right to pull in every agency that they've authorized to exist. So somewhere in between there, the president has some ability to hide information. So this idea about executive privilege isn't mentioned in the Constitution, but it's been exerted by almost every administration: Nixon, Trump, Obama, Clinton. Like, who should be able to say what about what's going on? We have a picture of Condoleezza Rice here. Condoleezza Rice was the head of the National Security Council in the executive office of the president to George W. Bush in the lead up to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And members of Congress, as we were investigating what happened and why we were making decisions about why we went to war, Condoleezza Rice was the head of the National Security Council at that time in the executive office of the president. By the time they actually go to start doing the investigations, she had become the Secretary of State, and she'd been confirmed Secretary of State by the Senate. So the Senate Oversight Committee called her in, and they said, "We need you to testify to tell us what you know in the run-up to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Did we know about weapons of mass destruction? How was the president making decisions? Blah, 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 blah." Well, she said, "I will come and testify to the members of the Oversight Committee from the moment I was pertaining to any information from the moment I was made Secretary of State onward. But I will not talk anything about what happened while I was head of the National Security Council." And they said, well, no, you have to tell us everything. And she said, "No, executive privilege. You didn't give me power. I was part of the executive office of the president, part of the National Security Council. You have no right to hear what we talked about at that point." And Congress said, "Well, I guess you're right." And they didn't. She came in and she testified about her time as Secretary of State because they'd given her power. But they hadn't given her power to exist in the National Security Council. She said, "No, I'm not going to do that." So executive privilege has been invoked by all these presidents to try and shelter some of their intimate discussions about what's going on with some of their closest confidants.